On a crisp autumn evening in 1975, in one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods, a vibrant 15-year-old girl lost her life in a crime that would haunt Greenwich, Connecticut for decades. This is the story of Martha Moxley, a case that would eventually intersect with one of America's most prominent political dynasties and remain unsolved for nearly half a century. I'm Allie, and this is True Crime from my couch. Belle Haven, Greenwich. Picture, if you will, sprawling mansions and meticulously manicured lawns, stone houses that speak of old money and privilege. This was and remains one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, a place where families like the Moxleys came seeking the epitome of the American dream. In the summer of 1974, the Moxleys had moved into their house on Walsh Lane, hoping to make this exclusive enclave their permanent home. Martha Moxley embodied the all-American teenager of the 1970s. With her blonde hair, pretty face, and vivacious personality, she quickly became popular in her new community. But on October 30th, 1975, Mischief Night, the evening before Halloween, Martha's life would come to a brutal end, mere steps from her front door. That afternoon had started normally enough. Martha was technically grounded for staying out late the previous weekend, but with her father out of town on business, she pleaded with her mother Dorothy to let her participate in the neighborhood's Mischief Night traditions. It was a childhood custom where local kids would engage in harmless pranks, ringing doorbells, throwing toilet paper in trees, the kind of teenage hijinks that seemed innocent enough in this sheltered community. Dorothy relented with one crucial condition. Martha had to be home by 9:30. As evening fell, nothing seemed amiss, but when 9:30 came and went without Martha's return, the first seeds of concern began to take root in Dorothy's mind. Still, this was Mischief Night. Perhaps Martha had lost track of time. But as the hours ticked by, 10, then 11, Dorothy's worry grew increasingly urgent. By 2:30 a.m., panic had fully set in. Dorothy began making calls, first to Martha's best friend Sheila, then to neighbor Tommy Skakel. Neither had seen Martha. Finally, at 3:45 a.m., Dorothy made the call no parent ever wants to make. She contacted the police. 3 officers responded, conducting a cursory search of the area with Dorothy. Finding nothing, they advised her to get some rest, suggesting Martha might return home on her own. Before leaving, they did file a missing persons report, a small comfort in what would become a mother's worst nightmare. The next morning, Dorothy awoke in the library where she'd been keeping vigil by the window. Her desperate hope that Martha had somehow slipped in during the night was quickly shattered when she found her daughter's bed empty and untouched. More calls followed, to Martha's friend Helen, who'd revealed she'd last seen Martha with Thomas Skakel near the Skakel family's pool around 9 or 9:30 p.m. the previous night. Increasingly desperate, Dorothy went to the Skakel residence, where Michael Skakel answered the door. Together, they checked a camper parked in the driveway, a possible place Martha might have fallen asleep, but there was no sign of her. Then, just before 1 p.m. on October 31st, the unthinkable happened. Martha's friend Sheila McGuire came running into the Moxley home, hysterical, saying something terrible had happened to Martha. Dorothy's friend Jean insisted on checking first, sparing Dorothy from the horrific scene that awaited. Martha's body, face down under a pine tree, barely 200 feet from her own home. The scene was brutal. Martha lay partially disrobed, her pants and underwear pulled down to her ankles. The back of her skull had been savagely beaten, and she'd been stabbed in the neck with a broken golf club. Nearby, investigators found pieces of a bloody and broken 6-iron golf club. The murder weapon had shattered into 3 pieces during the attack, with 2 pieces of the shaft near her body and another in the family's circular driveway. The leather grip handle was never found. For Greenwich law enforcement, this was unprecedented. There hadn't been a murder in the community for 30 years, let alone one so violent or involving someone so young. The investigation that followed would expose not only the dark underbelly of privilege, but also the devastating consequences of wealth and influence on justice. The first crucial mistakes in the investigation became apparent almost immediately. Greenwich had no medical examiner, forcing authorities to call the Connecticut State Medical Examiner from out of town. This created a critical delay. The autopsy wouldn't be performed until November 1st, well outside the ideal 24-hour window that typically provides the most accurate results. This delay meant the medical examiner could only determine that Martha died sometime between 9:30 p.m. on October 30th and 5:30 a.m. on October 31st. However, based on witness reports of dogs barking unusually in the neighborhood, investigators believe the murder occurred between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. The autopsy revealed the savage nature of the attack. Martha had been bludgeoned repeatedly until the golf club literally broke from the force of the blows. Then she was stabbed in the neck with the broken shaft. The frenzied, explosive nature of the attack led investigators to believe that Martha likely knew her killer. This wasn't a random act of violence, but something deeply personal. As police began piecing together Martha's final hours, a timeline emerged. She had left her house with 3 friends, Jackie, Jeffrey, and Helen, heading to the Skakel residence next door. This detail would prove crucial, as the Skakels weren't just wealthy neighbors. They were cousins of the Kennedy family, their Aunt Ethel married to Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The last people to see Martha alive were the 2 Skakel brothers, 17-year-old Thomas and 15-year-old Michael. Their father was away on a hunting trip. Their mother had passed away years earlier, leaving them in the care of a new live-in tutor, 23-year-old Kenneth Littleton. According to police reports, Thomas Skakel's initial account placed Martha's arrival at their house around 8:45 p.m. that night. What followed was a series of seemingly innocent teenage interactions. Michael, Martha, Helen, and Jeffrey listening to the radio in a car. Thomas would later join them, with Martha sitting between the 2 brothers. During this time, Thomas attempted to put his hand on Martha's leg twice, and some flirting ensued, culminating in a kiss between Martha and Thomas. Around 9:30 p.m., the dynamic shifted when John and Rustin Skakel, the brothers' siblings, announced plans to drive to their cousin's house. Thomas invited Martha along, but she declined, citing her curfew. This, according to Thomas, was the last time he saw Martha alive, watching her walk back toward her house. Thomas claimed he then returned inside to work on homework before watching television with Kenneth Littleton around 10 p.m. But the timeline immediately showed inconsistencies. When police questioned Kenneth Littleton about Thomas watching television with him, he confirmed it happened, but not at 10 p.m. as Thomas claimed, rather closer to 10:30 p.m. Michael's alibi seemed equally precarious. He told police he was at his cousin's house watching Monty Python, returning home around 11 p.m. The murder weapon would prove to be a crucial piece of evidence. A Tony Penna ladies' 6-iron, a high-end golf club. But this wasn't just any golf club. It bore an engraving with the name Anne Skakel, the deceased mother of Thomas and Michael. The club matched a set from the Skakel family residence, a set now missing exactly 1 club. The family had a habit of leaving golf clubs in bins around their yard for casual practice, making access to the murder weapon relatively easy for anyone familiar with the property. As investigators delved deeper into Tommy's connection to Martha, they discovered entries in her diary that painted a complex picture. She had written about Tommy's crush on her and his attempts to get to first and second base. More tellingly, in September 1975, just weeks before her murder, Martha had written, quote, "I can't be friends with Tom. Just because I talk to him, it doesn't mean I like him. I really have to stop going over there." Despite these revelations and the fact that Tommy was the last known person to see Martha alive, investigators couldn't find any physical evidence connecting him to the crime. He even underwent 2 polygraph tests. The first proved inconclusive, but the second came back clear. The investigation then turned to Kenneth Littleton, the Skakels' live-in tutor who had just moved into the residence on the very day of the murder. The 23-year-old teacher's story raised red flags. It seemed to change slightly with each telling, enough to catch investigators' attention. His troubled history with women and subsequent life trajectory didn't help his case. By April 1976, Littleton had been kicked out of the Skakel home following an arrest for burglary on Nantucket Island, committed while under the influence of alcohol and cocaine. His subsequent marriage revealed a pattern of alcohol addiction and mental health struggles, including alleged threats of violence. Yet, despite remaining a person of interest, no concrete evidence ever tied him to Martha's murder. As days turned to months and months to years, the investigation stalled. By Christmas of 1975, police had interviewed over 250 people and administered dozens of polygraph tests, only to find themselves back at square one. The case that had shocked Greenwich's privileged community was becoming cold. In 1978, a seemingly unrelated event would add another layer to the investigation. Michael Skakel's arrest for drunk driving. Rather than face prosecution, his influential family arranged for him to attend the Elon School in Maine, a controversial institution that would later play a crucial role in the case's development. The case lay dormant until 1991, when it was officially reopened following rumors, later proved false, that William Kennedy Smith, recently acquitted of rape charges, might have been at the Skakel residence the night of Martha's murder. While this lead proved fruitless, it brought renewed attention to the long cold case. In 1982, journalist Leonard Levitt had been hired to write about the case for a local newspaper. Though his story initially went unpublished, his investigation uncovered disturbing allegations about the original investigation. There were whispers of police payoffs, though the source was never specified. More concretely, Levitt documented a series of investigative failures that bordered on negligence. The extent of the investigative failures was staggering. After Martha's body was discovered, police had left it unattended, so poorly secured that a dog was found wandering through the crime scene. Rather than having trained personnel transport the body, they allowed a funeral director to move Martha to the medical examiner's office. Perhaps most shockingly, police never obtained a warrant to search the Skakel family home. Instead, they asked Tommy's older sister Julie to conduct the search herself, without any law enforcement oversight. Under intense scrutiny, an unexpected development emerged. Rushton Skakel, Thomas and Michael's father, commissioned a $1 million private investigation into the case. He hired the Sutton Associates, a team of retired investigators and FBI agents, to examine how exposed his sons were in the investigation. Their mission was to comb through every detail of the case with unprecedented thoroughness. But in 1995, this strategy would backfire spectacularly. A member of the Skakel family team leaked their findings to the press, and what emerged was devastating. The Sutton report laid bare every misstep, every contradiction, every change in the brothers' stories. Most significantly, it revealed that Thomas Skakel had lied about his final interactions with Martha that night. According to the Sutton investigation, Thomas's encounter with Martha hadn't ended on an innocent kiss at 9:30 p.m. as he'd originally claimed. Instead, their intimate interaction had continued until 10 p.m. But even more explosive was what the report revealed about Michael Skakel's activities that night. Michael's original story, that he'd left around 9:30 or 10 p.m. for his cousin's house, returned at 11 p.m. and gone straight to bed, was dramatically different than what he had told the Sutton investigators. In this new version, after returning home, he'd climbed a tree near the Moxley property. Whether this tree was outside Martha's window, her brother's window, or the tree that she would later be found under remained unclear. According to Michael, he had thrown rocks at her window, and when she didn't respond, he remained in the tree and masturbated. Some speculated the leak was strategic. As DNA technology advanced, Michael's admission to being present on the property and engaging in a sexual act could explain away any biological evidence that might be found at the scene. But this new narrative also raised troubling questions. How could someone climb that particular tree and not see Martha's body below? The case took another dramatic turn when former LAPD detective Mark Fuhrman entered the picture, writing a book that pointed to Michael Skakel as Martha's killer. Fuhrman's investigation revealed disturbing details about Michael's past. At just 15, he was already a functioning alcoholic, typically starting his daily drinking at 6 p.m. Fuhrman's most explosive finding came in the form of a book proposal allegedly written by Michael about his time at Elon School. According to Fuhrman, Michael described group therapy sessions where he was forced to wear a sign reading, quote, "I am an arrogant rich brat. Confront me on why I killed my friend Martha." Former Elon students corroborated these accounts, with some claiming Michael had explicitly confessed to the murder during these sessions. The school's controversial methods included what they called humiliation therapy, breaking someone down to build them back up. One student described Michael being thrown into a boxing ring and being beaten by other students in an attempt to force a confession. These accounts painted a disturbing picture of both the institution's practices and Michael's possible involvement in Martha's death. A possible motive emerged. Michael had allegedly been hopelessly in love with Martha, creating a rivalry between the brothers. The theory suggested that on the night of the murder, Michael, fueled by alcohol and drugs, witnessed Martha's interaction with Thomas, followed her home, and killed her in a jealous rage. In June 1998, within a month of Fuhrman's book publication, a one-person grand jury was appointed to review the case, a rare legal mechanism where a prosecutor can request a single juror to evaluate evidence. Kenneth Littleton testified in exchange for immunity, as did Helen's mother. Then, on January 19, 2000, Judge George N. Film made a decisive ruling. There was sufficient evidence to charge Michael Skakel with Martha's murder. At 39 years old, Michael was initially charged as a juvenile, given his age at the time of the crime, and released on $500,000 bond. The June 2000 pretrial hearing brought forward explosive testimony. Two former Elon School students claimed they had heard Michael confess to the murder. According to their accounts, he had described driving a golf club into Martha's head, though parts of the memory were missing from his mind. When questioned about their decades of silence, they offered a chilling explanation: fear of the Kennedy family's influence. One student, Gregory Coleman, recalled Michael bragging, quote, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." However, Coleman's credibility would later be challenged when he admitted to being high on heroin during his testimony. Before the case concluded, Coleman died of a drug overdose, leaving his testimony in a precarious position. The reliability of these accounts became a point of fierce debate, with other Elon students offering contradictory recollections. Some insisted Michael never discussed the murder, while others maintained it was a frequent topic of confrontation. Another witness, Michael's friend Andy Pugh, provided testimony that seemed to corroborate part of Michael's revised narrative. Pugh claimed that shortly after the murder, Michael had told him about climbing a tree and masturbating, specifically the same tree under which Martha's body was found. This detail would become a crucial point of contention. How could someone climb that particular tree without noticing the body below? Perhaps one of the most damning pieces of evidence was a 30-minute audio recording of Michael himself. In it, he acknowledged being outside Martha's house that night and masturbating in the tree, though he steadfastly denied any involvement in her murder. He claimed he'd gone there hoping to get a kiss from her, and when she didn't appear, he'd acted out his sexual impulse alone. A conversation analyst who examined this recording noted peculiar patterns in Michael's speech. The frequent use of phrases like, "I remember this," suggested someone constructing a narrative rather than naturally recalling events. Moreover, when describing learning of Martha's murder the next morning, Michael's immediate concern wasn't shock at her death, but rather that he would be blamed, a reaction that raised red flags for investigators. By February 2001, the case took another significant turn when a judge ruled that Michael should be tried as an adult. The reasoning was practical. At 40 years old, there was no juvenile treatment facility that could accommodate him. If convicted, prison was the only viable option. The trial in 2002 lasted 3 weeks and ended with a stunning verdict. Michael Skakel was found guilty of Martha Moxley's murder, despite the absence of physical evidence linking him to the crime. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, all while maintaining his innocence. What followed was a decade of legal battles, appeals, challenges, and petitions, all denied. But on October 23, 2013, the case took yet another dramatic turn when Judge Thomas Bishop ruled that Michael's original lawyer had failed to provide adequate representation. Less than a month later, after more than 10 years behind bars, Michael was released on a $1.2 million bond. The conditions of his release were strict: GPS monitoring, no contact with the Moxley family, regular check-ins with a parole officer, and confined to Connecticut, though he would later receive special permission to relocate to Westchester County, New York. The case continued to generate controversy and speculation. In 2016, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. published Framed: Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Did Not Commit. The book proposed alternative suspects, notably Tony Bryant, cousin of basketball star Kobe Bryant, and 2 other teenagers known as Adolph and Bert. According to Bryant's account, which emerged a year after Michael's conviction, Adolph and Bert were the real killers. Bryant claimed Adolph had been obsessed with Martha, who showed no interest in him. He stated that everyone had access to the golf clubs on the Skakel property, and that on mischief night, several people, including himself and the 2 suspects, had been carrying them around. However, when called to testify about these claims in court, Bryant invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. Notably, no one else has ever corroborated his story about the 3 being in the neighborhood on that night. The physical evidence in the case remains frustratingly inconclusive. 2 hairs found on a police blanket didn't match the Skakel brothers, but they've never been tested against any other potential suspects. Dorothy Moxley, Martha's mother, dismisses the theory about Adolph and Bert, maintaining her belief that Michael and a group of his friends were responsible for her daughter's murder. In 2018, after years of legal maneuvering, Michael Skakel's conviction was finally vacated by the Connecticut Supreme Court. The justices ruled that his attorney's failure to call an alibi witness could have changed the trial's outcome. Then, on October 30th, 2020, exactly 45 years after Martha's murder, Connecticut's chief state's attorney made a stunning announcement. They would not retry Michael Skakel. The prosecution concluded they could not prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Today, the murder of Martha Moxley remains officially unsolved. For Dorothy Moxley, the pain has evolved but never truly subsided. "I don't cry as much anymore," she says, "but it still hurts." She recalls hearing voices outside her house that fateful night, but dismissed them as typical mischief night activity. Now, she believes those voices might have belonged to Martha's killers. Not just one person, but a group of them. John Moxley, Martha's brother, often wonders about the life his sister never got to live. He admits to struggling against the pool of darkness this case could have drawn him into, choosing instead to remember Martha as she was, vibrant, alive, and full of promise. He shares his mother's suspicions about the influence of wealth and power on the case, believing that the Skakel family's connection to the Kennedys both helped and hindered the search for truth, drawing attention to the case, but potentially also shielding certain avenues of investigation. In the end, the The murder of Martha Moxley stands as a stark reminder that privilege and power can cast long shadows over justice. In the seemingly perfect world of Belle Haven, where manicured lawns and stone mansions project an image of American success, a 15-year-old girl lost her life mere steps from safety. The decades-long search for her killer exposed the dark underbelly of wealth and influence, the fallibility of memory, and the devastating impact of time on the pursuit of truth. For the Moxley family, the questions that have haunted them since that October night in 1975 may never be fully answered. But Martha's memory lives on, not just as a victim in a notorious murder case, but as a daughter, a sister, and a vibrant young woman whose life was cut tragically short. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case is its setting, not in a dark alley or an abandoned building, but in one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods, on a night dedicated to harmless teenage pranks. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes happen not in the shadows, but right in our own backyards. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you've enjoyed my deep dive into the case of Martha Moxley, I would love to have you join me again next week. Remember, you can find all of the show notes and links and resources mentioned in today's episode in the description. I'm also active on social media, where I hope to continue this conversation about the case throughout the week. The best way to support my show is to subscribe, leave a rating, and share with a friend who might also enjoy these conversations. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Bye.